Did you ask the homeowner for permission? The question left my mouth with a calmness that surprised even me. I had just opened the door to my apartment in Inglewood, grocery bags still swinging heavily from my arms, and there she was, Keisha, my daughter-in-law. She stood right in the middle of my living room, as if there were nothing to explain, as if this had always been her place. At Keisha's feet were two enormous suitcases, standing neatly side by side, so neatly that I had the unsettling feeling they'd been there long before I got home. On her face was an expression that blended surprise and something worse, annoyance, as if I were the intruder, as if my presence had just ruined a carefully calculated plan. Keisha looked up at me, blinked twice, then let out a soft laugh, the kind of awkward laugh she always used when someone confronted her. Short, sharp, carefully designed to make the other person feel like they were overreacting. But I didn't turn away. I didn't avoid her gaze. I stood there, right at the threshold of my own home, Veronica Mills, 68 years old, arms still wrapped tightly around bags full of vegetables and canned goods, waiting for an answer she clearly hadn't prepared. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Veronica. I didn't hear you come in." Keisha's voice was light, almost melodic, as if we were just making small talk about the weather, as if the two suitcases didn't exist, as if her showing up in my apartment on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced, unasked, without a shred of consideration, were completely normal, as if this weren't my space, not my shelter, not the only place in this world where I could still breathe without someone demanding something from me. I didn't move. I stayed right there at the doorway, feeling the weight of the grocery bags digging into my arms, leaving burning red marks. But I didn't put them down. And then, at the exact moment my eyes landed on those two suitcases, something inside me hardened. Something that had once been soft, once pliable, once always ready to give in. That was how I had lived for years. But in that moment, I knew I had finally reached a boundary. "Let me ask you something, Keisha." My voice was lower this time, firmer. Keisha lifted a hand and tucked a perfectly styled strand of hair behind her ear, a familiar gesture she used whenever she needed a few extra seconds to figure out what sounded reasonable. Her eyes, lightly made up to match the designer top she was wearing, avoided mine for just a second, then returned with a small smile. That smile, the one that subtly puts other people beneath her, the one I despised. "Mrs. Veronica, don't make such a big deal out of this," she said. "Dante and I just need to stay here for a few days. Our place in Hawthorne is being renovated. It's unbearably noisy." She spoke without pause. "The workers start at 6 in the morning and don't stop until 7 at night. We can't sleep. We can't work. We can't live with all that noise." And then Keisha finished with a sentence so light in tone, yet so heavy it felt like a verdict. "We figured staying here temporarily wouldn't be a problem. After all, you live alone, and you have 2 bedrooms that you don't even use." There it was. One sentence, enough to perfectly sum up how my family had seen me for years. "You live alone, and you have rooms you don't use." As if my life were an empty space waiting to be filled by other people's needs, as if the quiet I had fought so hard to preserve were a waste, as if the absence of sleeping bodies in the next rooms automatically turned my home into communal property, available to anyone who needed it. As if 68 years of my existence gave me no right to decide when, how, and with whom I shared my space. And I, Veronica Mills, a black woman who worked double shifts to raise her child, a woman who spent her entire youth serving others in cafes and offices all across Los Angeles, finally understood one thing. It was time for me to say no. And if you think it all stopped with 2 suitcases in my living room, you're wrong. Because the very next moment, when my son walked through that door, was when every boundary I had left would be tested to its absolute limit. Don't go anywhere. The next part will show you why saying no is sometimes the bravest thing a mother can do. I stepped fully into the apartment and set the grocery bags down on the dining table. The sound of canned goods knocking against the wooden surface rang out louder than I expected, a dry, hard noise that echoed clearly in the otherwise quiet space. Keisha took a step back, just one small step, almost unnoticeable. But I saw it. Her body language had changed. She was no longer as comfortable as she had been when I first opened the door. The confidence she always wore so easily began to crack. Irritation seeped through every movement. I stood beside the table. I didn't open the bags. I didn't head toward the kitchen the way I had done for years out of habit. Both of my hands rested flat on the wooden surface. I could feel my own pulse throbbing at my fingertips. This wasn't fear, not anxiety. It was something else. The feeling of someone who has just realized they've reached a point of no return. "Does Dante know you're here?" The question was rhetorical. I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear it. I needed confirmation of what I suspected, that my son had approved this, that he had been part of this plan from the beginning, that the two of them had decided one thing together. My consent was unnecessary. Keisha sighed, a long, exaggerated sigh, as if I were being unbearably unreasonable. "Of course he knows, Mrs. Veronica. It was actually his idea. He's wrapping up a few things at the office and will come by later with the rest of the stuff." She paused, then added lightly, "I thought Dante had already called to let you know." No, he hadn't. And that silence, the absence of a simple phone call, told me everything I needed to know. My son, Dante Mills, the child I raised alone after his father disappeared from our lives when Dante was only 7 years old. The son I supported with wages from double shifts, from cleaning offices and making coffee for other people. The boy who once clung to me and promised that when he grew up, he would take care of his mother for the rest of her life. That same child now believed that moving into my home without asking was perfectly acceptable, as if I were an extension of his convenience, a resource readily available. I walked toward the 2 suitcases, stood in front of them, staring as if they were foreign objects that had dropped from another planet. They were expensive, the same brands Keisha liked to show off on social media. Shiny, brand new. They were probably bought on one of the trips they took every few months, while I was still using the old suitcase I'd purchased 15 years ago at a clearance sale. I turned back to Keisha. "And you think this is okay? Showing up at my home with these suitcases without asking if I agree? Not considering for even a moment that I might have my own plans? That I might value my privacy? That I might not want anyone living here?" Keisha crossed her arms over her chest. Her posture shifted completely. She was no longer the relaxed, easygoing daughter-in-law. Defensiveness showed in every line of her body. "Mrs. Veronica, you're Dante's mother. We're family. I don't understand why you're making this so complicated." She tilted her head, her voice edged with reproach. "It's just a few days, maybe a week. We're not asking for anything unreasonable. And besides," she hesitated briefly, "I thought you'd be happy to have some company." Then she finished with a sentence that made my chest tighten. "You always say this house feels empty. If you've ever admitted a moment of vulnerability to family, if you've ever spoken your loneliness, only to have those words used as justification to cross your boundaries, stay with me. Because what happened next wasn't just an argument. It was the moment I realized I had been misunderstood for years. Empty. The word echoed in my head like the bell at a funeral. Yes, I had said the house felt quiet since my sister Pauline moved in with her daughter last year, but there is a vast difference between quiet and empty. My home was quiet because I chose it that way, because after decades of noise, demands, and always being available to everyone except myself, I had finally found peace in stillness. But Keisha had taken that casual confession and turned it into justification, as if my moment of vulnerability had given her the right to invade my space, as if admitting that I was sometimes lonely meant I was asking someone to fill every corner of my life without permission. "Listen carefully." My voice dropped, but it did not tremble. Keisha stopped moving. Something in my tone made her pay attention for the first time since stepping into this apartment. How this house feels to me is my right. It can be quiet, or it can be noisy. It can be empty, or it can be full. I paused. But what it will never be is available for anyone to decide to use without my permission. I stepped closer. My voice did not waver. I am the owner of this home, Keisha. Not a convenient option when the two of you have a problem. Keisha opened her mouth to respond, and at that exact moment, we heard a key turn in the lock. The door opened. Dante walked in, my son, carrying 2 more bags, and wearing an easy smile, as if everything were still under his control. "Mom, I'm glad you're home. Keisha explained everything already, right? We'll just be here for a week, 2 at most. You won't even notice we're here." The words hung in the air as if they were the most reasonable thing in the world. Dante set the bags down on the floor beside the suitcases, brushed his hands on his pants, then looked at me with an expression I knew all too well, the same look he had when he was 12, when he came home late after playing basketball with his friends, that pleading look asking me not to be angry, because after all, he was just a kid. But Dante was no longer 12. He was 42, and I was no longer the young, exhausted mother willing to give in simply because I was too tired to fight another battle. I remained standing by the dining table, both hands resting on the wood, watching my son move through the apartment as if it were his territory. As if 40 years hadn't passed, as if being his mother meant I automatically surrendered any expectation of respect or consideration. Dante stepped closer, leaning in to kiss my cheek out of habit. I didn't move. I didn't step back. But I didn't lean toward him either. I stayed exactly where I was. And perhaps Dante sensed something in my posture, because he stopped mid-motion. A flicker of confusion crossed his face before being quickly covered by a wider, more forced smile. "What's wrong, Mom? Did you have a bad day?" A bad day? As if my reaction were just the result of a temporary mood. As if I were irritated because I'd stood too long in line at the bank or got stuck in traffic on the way home. Not because my son and daughter-in-law had decided to move into my home without asking. Not because they treated my opinion as irrelevant. Not because they assumed my life, my space, and my peace were resources available for their convenience. "I didn't have a bad day, Dante," I said. "I just had an unpleasant surprise coming home and finding your wife moving in, without anyone asking whether I agreed." Dante chuckled softly. A real laugh, as if I'd just said something funny. He ran a hand through his hair, a familiar gesture whenever he thought someone was overreacting, and shook his head. "Mom, don't be so dramatic. I called you twice this morning and you didn't pick up. I figured you were out and we could get everything settled before you got home. It's not that big a deal." I turned to look at Keisha. She stood beside the suitcases, arms still crossed, watching the exchange between me and Dante with irritation, and something more dangerous, a vague satisfaction. As if this confrontation confirmed what she had suspected all along, that I was difficult, that I was unreasonable, that I was an obstacle in a situation that should have been simple. "You called twice, and when I didn't answer, you decided that gave you the right to move into my home?" "We're not moving in, Mom," Dante said. "Just staying temporarily for a few days." As he spoke, Dante walked toward the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator as if it were second nature, took out a bottle of water I'd bought earlier that afternoon, and drank straight from it. That gesture, so small it might have meant nothing to an outsider, felt like confirmation of everything I was thinking. Dante didn't see a distinction between his space and mine. To him, my home was an extension of his. My refrigerator, my food, my privacy, all of it was shared territory to which he had unlimited access. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to contain the pressure building in my chest. This wasn't anger yet. It was something deeper, older, the accumulated weight of decades spent being the one who always gave in, who always understood, who always put other people's needs before her own. It was the exhaustion of someone who had spent her entire adult life being useful, available, and convenient for everyone, except herself. If you've ever asked yourself, where did I go wrong? If you've ever looked at your child and realized that what hurts you today may have grown from what you taught them long ago, stay. Because the next moment wasn't about Dante, it was about me and the lesson I had taught my son for years, without realizing it. I remembered one very specific evening. Dante was 8 years old. It had been an especially hard day at the cafe where I worked. A customer had yelled because his order took too long. My boss scolded me for something that wasn't my fault. I came home with legs so swollen I could barely walk. Dante was sitting in the living room watching television when I walked in. "Mom," he said, without taking his eyes off the screen, "I'm hungry." I set the bags down by the door, slipped off the shoes that were crushing my aching feet, and I went straight into the kitchen to make him food. I didn't even sit down. I didn't even take a minute for myself. Because that's what good mothers do. Good mothers put their children's needs above everything else. But what was I really teaching him? I was teaching him that women exist to serve, that mothers don't have boundaries, that saying, "Give me a moment, I'm tired," is selfish, rather than the most basic form of self-care. And now, 34 years later, my son had grown up believing exactly that. It wasn't entirely his fault. I had been his most consistent teacher in that wrong lesson, every time I ignored my own needs for him, every time I smiled through exhaustion, every time I pretended everything was fine, while inside I was slowly breaking. I taught him that I mattered less than he did, and Dante, he learned that lesson perfectly. "How many days is a few days, Dante?" He shrugged, still holding the water bottle in his hand, not looking directly at me. "A week? 2 weeks at most. The contractors said they'll be done quickly. Just until we can sleep in our own bedroom without a drill waking us up at 6 in the morning. 2 weeks, 14 days with 2 other people in my space, using my bathroom, eating my food, disrupting the small routines it had taken me years to rebuild. 14 days of not being able to walk through my living room in my nightgown if I got thirsty in the middle of the night. 14 days of having to factor in someone else's schedule before deciding whether I could watch my favorite show or turn the music up a little louder. 14 days of giving up the peace I had worked so hard to claim after years of noise and chaos. And you just assumed I'd be fine with that? Dante finally twisted the cap back onto the bottle. He looked at me with what he tried to pass off as patience, but I recognized it instantly as thinly veiled condescension. "Mom, you're my mother. Of course I assumed you'd be fine. What do you want me to do? Go stay at a hotel and spend $150 a night when you have 2 empty bedrooms here? That doesn't make sense." $150 a night. There it was, the bare truth, without makeup. It wasn't because they needed me. It wasn't because they wanted to spend time with me. It was money. It was economic convenience. It was the calculation that using my apartment for free made more sense than paying for their own comfort. And I, like always, was expected to understand, to be reasonable, to place their financial needs above my emotional quiet. Keisha cleared her throat from her place beside the suitcases. When she spoke, her voice softened, the conciliatory tone people use when they want to sound reasonable while still steering the situation in their favor. "Mrs. Veronica, we really don't want to cause you any trouble. If that's the issue, we can contribute to the costs. I mean," she hesitated, "maybe an extra $50 toward utilities. We'll be using water, electricity. Contributing like that is fair." $50. As if the issue were the light bill. As if my privacy could be given a price tag, as if my small routines, my quiet mornings on the balcony with a cup of coffee, just existing, not as a mother, not as a mother-in-law, not as a hostess or any other role people needed me to play, could be itemized on a spreadsheet. "It's not about the money, Keisha." My voice sounded more tired than I intended. Dante stepped closer again. This time, he put a hand on my shoulder, the same gesture he'd used 1,000 times to soften me. "So what is it about, Mom?" "Just tell us what's bothering you, and we'll fix it. You want us to buy the groceries? No problem. You want us to clean everything before we leave? We can do that. You don't want us making noise in the morning? We'll be quiet as mice. Just tell me what you need." What I needed was for them to have asked me first. What I needed was for them to have considered that maybe I had the right to say no. What I needed was for them to understand that family does not equal automatic access to every corner of my life without my consent. But how was I supposed to say all of that without being labeled the selfish mother, the difficult mother-in-law, the unreasonable woman who refused to help her own family? Gently, I moved Dante's hand off my shoulder. Not harshly, but firmly enough to make it clear that his gesture wasn't welcome in that moment. What I need, Dante, is for you to understand one thing. This is my home, not a hotel, not a backup option, not a resource you tap into every time you're inconvenienced. I took a deep breath. This is where I live, where I rest, and where I have the right to decide who comes in and who stays. But we're your family. The reply came instantly, so fast it was almost automatic, as if those 4 words were an argument no one could argue with, as if sharing blood erased any expectation of respect or consideration. And maybe, for a very long time, I had believed that too. Maybe for years, I accepted that being family meant always being available, always understanding, always sacrificing my own needs for theirs. But something had changed. Maybe it was turning 68 and realizing time is no longer endless. Maybe it was my friend Ruthie Grant's death last year, a woman who spent her final days regretting that she had never once lived for herself. Or maybe it was simply the accumulated exhaustion of decades spent being invisible in my own life. Exactly because you're my family, this hurts more, Dante. Because I expect you, more than anyone, to understand that I also have rights. Rights over my space, rights over my peace, and rights over my own decisions. Dante glanced at Keisha, just for a second, very quick. But I saw it. It was the look couples give each other when they think they're dealing with a difficult person, when they feel the need to stand united against what they see as a shared problem. And in that moment, I was the problem. Dante sighed, not the kind of sigh born of sadness, but the kind he used whenever he felt a conversation had gone on longer than necessary, and, in his mind, should have been over long ago. He brought both hands to his face, rubbing hard from his forehead down to his chin, a frustrated gesture that was now barely concealed, then looked at me with an expression he had perfected over the years, the expression of a patient son enduring a complicated mother. "Okay, Mom. I get that you're mad we didn't give you more notice. On that, you're right." He paused, then went on, his voice dropping, not to apologize but to steer. "But we're already here now. The luggage is already inside. Keisha has already unpacked a few things in the living room. What do you want us to do now?" He tilted his head, as if the question were entirely reasonable. "Go find a hotel at 6 p.m. on a Thursday? When I have a meeting at 7 in the morning tomorrow?" There it was, the guilt, not presented as emotion, but arranged as a chain of practical inconveniences I would cause if I refused to give in. As if their decision to settle in without my permission now obligated me to accept the situation. As if their lack of planning automatically became a problem I was required to solve. I looked down the hallway leading to the bedrooms. One door was slightly ajar. From where I stood, I could see the corner of a bed, with clothes already laid out on top, no longer tucked neatly inside a suitcase. Keisha had said she'd only opened a few things, but I knew very well the difference between opening and moving in. I walked toward that room. I heard Dante's footsteps behind me, then Keisha's voice, saying something very softly to him, too low for me to catch the words, but enough to know they were talking to each other, not to me. I pushed the door fully open. What I saw confirmed every suspicion in my mind. It wasn't just clothes on the bed. Toiletries were lined up neatly on the dresser. Keisha's travel kit was open beside the mirror. 2 pairs of shoes were placed against the wall. A laptop sat plugged in beside the nightstand. This wasn't the setup of people staying a few days. This was how people arrange themselves when they plan to stay for weeks. I turned around. Dante was standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching me carefully, as if waiting to see which way my reaction would fall. "A week, you said." He nodded, though his eyes slipped away from mine for just a second before returning. 2 weeks max, Mom. I already told you." I pointed back into the room. "And all of this is for 2 weeks?" The laptop, the toiletries, enough clothes for a month. Dante shrugged, that familiar, easy shrug he used whenever he wanted to downplay something he knew mattered. "Keisha needs to work from here. And of course, we brought what we need to be comfortable. We can't live out of suitcases for 2 whole weeks." Comfortable. The word echoed in my head. They needed to be comfortable in my home, in my space, using my resources. And I, as usual, was simply expected to understand. There was a very brief moment when I wondered if I was making too big a deal out of everything, whether I was turning a situation that could be handled simply into an unnecessary war, whether I was about to become the image of the difficult old mother, the one people would later talk about with a sigh. Just one moment. Then the memory of Ruthie Grant pulled me back. I remembered the nights at Centinela Hospital with Ruthie. 3 months before she passed, we sat together in that hospital room. Machines beeped constantly. The cold white light washed over her thin face. Ruthie held my hand. Her fingers were so weak I was afraid I'd hurt her if I squeezed too tightly. "Veronica," she said, her voice almost swallowed by the sound of the machines. "My biggest mistake was caring more about what other people thought of me than what I thought of myself." She paused to catch her breath. "I spent 70 years becoming what other people needed. And now, when I'm about to die, I can't remember a single moment I lived for myself." She tightened her grip on my hand. "Don't make my mistake. Don't wait until it's too late. If you need to say no, say it. If you need space, take it. If you need to choose yourself, do it. Because no one else will do it for you." I left the bedroom and walked back into the living room. Keisha was sitting in my favorite armchair, the one by the window, the one I bought 3 years ago after months of saving, the one I sit in to read every afternoon, the one where I drink my coffee every morning, the one where I sat and cried after Ruthie's funeral, the one where I sat and decided to finally quit the exhausting cafe job and take my pension. Keisha sat there with her phone in hand, scrolling with the relaxed focus of someone who doesn't see a threat approaching. When she noticed me, she looked up and smiled. "Mrs. Veronica, we really will cause as little trouble as possible. You honestly won't even notice we're here. I work remotely, so I'll just be in the room all day. Dante leaves early and comes home late. We can buy our own food or cook for all 3 of us, whichever you prefer. Whichever I prefer. As if those choices were real. As if I were truly being given a say, and not just presented with different versions of a situation I had never agreed to in the first place." I walked over to the armchair. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there looking at Keisha, waiting to see if she could understand what I was saying without any words at all. Her smile slowly faded. She blinked. Then, a little awkwardly, she stood up. "Sorry. Did you want to sit?" I didn't want to sit. I wanted her to understand that every inch of this space belonged to me. I moved to the armchair and sat down, slowly, deliberately. My eyes never left Keisha. "This is my home, Keisha. I pay the rent. I pay the bills. I decide who comes in." I paused. "And right now, I'm deciding that I need the 2 of you to leave." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the ticking of the kitchen clock. Dante froze. His hand still hung mid-air where my shoulder had been. He stared at me as if his brain were refusing to process what it had just heard. Keisha made a small sound, somewhere between a sharp inhale and a disbelieving laugh. "What did you just say?" Dante's voice was higher than usual. "Mom, you're joking, right?" I looked straight at him. "I'm not joking. I need you to pack your things and leave." Keisha stepped forward, both hands extended in front of her, in a gesture that looked like she wanted to make peace, but in her eyes was a barely restrained desperation. "Mrs. Veronica, please wait. We can talk about this. If we did something wrong, we can fix it. You don't have to kick us out. We're family." Family. There it was again, dragged out once more like a shield, like a justification, as if simply saying family automatically erased every need for basic respect. As if, just because we share blood, I am required to endure anything, any invasion, any lack of consideration. Exactly because you are family, this hurts the way it does. I looked straight at both of them. Because I expect you, more than anyone, to understand that I also deserve to be treated with dignity. Dante laughed. This time the laugh was longer, sharper, saturated with disbelief. He turned away, took a few steps toward the window, then spun back around as if he needed to move in order for his mind to process what was happening. "This is insane. You're being completely unreasonable. You're really going to throw your son out onto the street?" He threw his arms out, pointing at the suitcases like they were evidence. "For what? Because we showed up a few hours before we could talk to you? Because we didn't follow some ridiculous ritual you just made up?" I didn't raise my voice, but my words came out crisp and clear. "I didn't just make up anything, Dante. Asking before you move into someone's home is not a ridiculous ritual. It's basic respect. It's what you would do with anyone else in your life, and it's what you'd expect others to do with you." Dante shook his head, hands on his hips, looking at me as if he were looking at a complete stranger. "I can't believe you're doing this after everything we've done for you." That sentence dropped between us like a stone thrown into a calm lake. Everything we've done for you. I waited for him to continue, waited for him to list exactly what everything meant. But he stayed silent, as if that one sentence alone was an argument strong enough to end the discussion. "Everything you've done for me," I repeated slowly. "Then tell me, Dante. Help me remember exactly what you've done for me. That, in your mind, is enough for me to sacrifice my peace." Dante opened his mouth, then closed it again. He glanced at Keisha, searching for backup, but Keisha was staring at the floor, biting her lower lip. He turned back to me, and this time it wasn't just irritation or disbelief in his eyes. It was real anger, climbing higher. "You want a list? Fine. We bought you that new TV last year when your old one broke." I nodded slightly. "You offered to pay for it. You told me I didn't need to pay you back, that it was a gift. And then for the next 6 months, every family dinner you brought it up as an example of how generous you are." Dante scoffed. "We drove you to the emergency room when you sprained your ankle." "Because I had no other way to get there and you happened to be passing by on your way home," I replied. "You dropped me off right in front of the ER and went straight back. You didn't come in with me. I sat there waiting for 3 hours by myself until a nurse noticed I was struggling to walk and called a taxi to take me home." His lips pressed into a line, but I didn't stop. "You invite me to dinner every time you're celebrating something." "You invite me," I said, my voice still calm, "when you need another person to split the bill, or when you need to look good in front of someone, to show that you're a good son who takes his mother out to eat. But during those evenings, you talk to each other, you check your phones, you make plans for the future, with no place for me in it. I sit there like a piece of family decor." Dante took a step forward, and this time, something in him shifted the air in the room. Not a physical threat, but the concentrated emotional energy of someone about to explode. "Do you know what your problem is?" he asked, his voice a tone higher. "Nothing anyone does for you is ever enough. There's always something wrong. There's always a but. You always find a way to make yourself the victim." "I'm not playing the victim," I said, each word clear. "I'm setting a boundary, and those two things are worlds apart." "No." Dante shook his head, laughing bitterly. "What you're doing is punishing me because your life didn't turn out the way you wanted, because Dad left, because you had to work so hard, because you're lonely. And now, when I finally have some stability, when I finally need your help with something, you decide this is the perfect time to collect emotional debts for things that happened decades ago. Those words landed on me like blows, not meant for discussion, meant to hurt, to make me doubt myself, to twist a completely legitimate boundary into some warped act of revenge. And the most painful part was, there was a kernel of truth buried in there. Yes, sometimes I feel lonely. Yes, I carry old resentments. Yes, there have been times I looked back at my life and wondered where all that time, all that energy, all the versions of Veronica before she became mom, employee, the one who always helps, went. But none of that changed a simple truth. I have a right to my space. I deserve to be asked. And my life is not open territory for anyone to walk into whenever it suits them. If you've ever been told by family, you're always playing the victim just because you finally dared to say no, you probably know this feeling better than anyone. It isn't an explosive rage. It's the feeling of someone twisting your entire life into a distorted story, and then using that story to force you back into silence. I took a deep breath. "You're right about one thing, Dante," I said, looking straight at him. "My life did not go the way I once hoped it would. But do you know which part is the part I truly wish hadn't gone this way?" I paused, feeling my throat tighten. "It's the part where I raised a child who looks at me like a resource instead of a person. It's the part where I spent years being so useful that I forgot what it felt like to be valued. It's the part where I convinced myself that love is measured in silent sacrifices and needs shoved to the bottom." A memory surfaced, sharp as an old film clip. Dante was 15. He needed a new pair of basketball shoes, the kind every boy on the team was wearing. Price, $120. That weekend, I picked up 3 extra shifts. My feet swelled so badly I could barely squeeze into my regular shoes, but I still bought the shoes. When I handed him the box, Dante opened the lid, looked inside. "Thanks, Mom," he said absently, eyes still glued to the screen. No hug, no brief pause to notice what I might have gone through to make it happen. Because in his mind, it was just normal. That's what mothers do. Mothers sacrifice. Mothers provide. Mothers have no limit to what they'll give. And I never once showed him another version. Keisha spoke up then. Her voice was shaking, but she was still trying to sound reasonable. "Please, Mrs. Veronica, Dante, everyone, can we just calm down? This doesn't have to end like this. We can find a solution." "We can't." My voice was much calmer than what was churning inside me. "Keisha, you two need a place to stay. I need my space. Those two things don't go together. It's not complicated." Dante lifted one of the suitcases and turned toward the hallway, stopping right at the threshold. He didn't look at me when he spoke, and his voice now was completely different. Cold, distant, hard. "When you change your mind, when you realize what you've just done, don't expect me to come back like nothing happened. Don't expect me to forget that you kicked me out, right when I needed you." I answered without flinching. "I'm not kicking you out when you need me, Dante. I'm forcing you to leave. When you decided that what you call need gives you the right to ignore me, ignore my consent, ignore my boundaries." He didn't reply. He just turned away and walked fully into the hallway. Keisha picked up the second suitcase. Before she left, she turned back to look at me. Her face was flushed, streaked with tears. "I really don't understand you, Mrs. Veronica. I truly don't. What kind of mother does this?" I looked right at her. The kind of mother who finally learned that loving herself isn't selfish. It's how she survives. Keisha shook her head, muttering something I couldn't make out, then walked down the hallway where Dante was waiting for the elevator. I stood at the threshold of my own home, watching them. Dante's back was rigid, the posture of someone convinced he is the victim of a betrayal. Keisha's head was bent over her phone, probably searching for a nearby hotel. The elevator arrived with a soft ding. The doors slid open. Dante stepped in first, yanking his suitcase so hard it banged against the metal frame. Keisha stepped in after him. Right before the doors closed completely, Dante turned and looked at me one last time. He didn't say a word, but his face held an entire storm: disappointment, anger, confusion, and deeper still, the pain of someone who believes he has just lost something important. A part of me wanted to rush forward, throw my hand between the doors, tell them to come back, say I was sorry, that they could stay, that this was all just a misunderstanding. That part of me had been fed for decades. The part that always prioritized other people's comfort over my own peace. The part that was taught conflict is the worst thing in the world, worse even than living in constant quiet misery. But I didn't move. I stood still, watching the metal doors slide shut, listening to the sound of the motor pulling the car down. And with every floor the elevator descended, I knew I was also closing a very long chapter of my life. The elevator door sealed. My Inglewood apartment returned to silence, and I, Veronica Mills, stood alone in my own space, and finally exhaled. I turned back inside and closed the door. The silence waiting for me this time was completely different from every other night before. It was no longer the gentle quiet of a loneliness I had chosen. It was the heavy quiet of consequences, of a hard decision, of bridges that might have just burned behind me. I walked toward the guest bedroom, the one Keisha had started settling into. Her clothes were still spread out on the bed. Her toiletries were lined neatly on the dresser. The laptop was still plugged in by the nightstand, the charging light blinking faintly in the dark. I began to pack their things. I folded the clothes carefully, though my hands were trembling a little. I put all the toiletries into a plastic bag. I unplugged the laptop and laid it neatly on the bed with the rest of their belongings. I didn't do this out of malice. I did it because I needed to reclaim this room as what it actually is, my guest room. I needed it to stop being the room someone else gave themselves permission to settle into, and return to being an empty space. Empty. But empty because I chose it. When I finished, I left everything arranged on the bed. If Dante or Keisha came back to collect their things, they would find everything ready, neatly stacked, not thrown around, because that is still who I am, someone who can draw a very clear boundary without destroying what belongs to others, someone who can say no without having to smash everything around her. I went back to the living room and sat in the armchair by the window, my favorite spot. Outside, evening was deepening. One by one, the windows in the surrounding apartments lit up, small, warm, yellow squares hanging against the ink-blue sky. I suddenly wondered, in how many of those windows was someone living a story just like mine right now? How many women were sitting in their living rooms, wrestling with the weight of a boundary they had just set? How many had just asked themselves, did I do the wrong thing? My phone vibrated in the pocket of my sweater. I took it out, a text from Dante. Just 3 words. Hope you're happy. I didn't respond. Because I wasn't happy. There was nothing happy about what had just happened. There was no victory in closing the door in my son's face, no satisfaction in knowing it might take weeks, maybe months before we spoke again. But there was something else, not joy, but just as important, clarity. The solid feeling that, for the first time in decades, I had chosen my dignity over someone else's emotional comfort. The feeling that I had just reclaimed something I hadn't even realized I'd lost. The right to say no without having to justify it forever. A second message came through, this time from Keisha. Dante is really upset. I don't think he'll call you for a long time. I hope your pride is worth it. Pride, as if setting a limit were some petty ego trip. As if protecting my space were arrogance, not the most basic form of self-care. As if the problem lay in my resistance, not in their intrusion. I turned off my phone, not because I was running from the consequences of my decision, but because I needed quiet. I needed space to process everything that had just happened, without being interrupted by messages written with one goal, to make me feel guilty. I got up and went into the kitchen. The grocery bags were still on the table, exactly where I had set them down earlier, in what felt like hours ago, though it had probably only been about 45 minutes. I started putting things away, almost on autopilot. Vegetables into the fridge, canned goods onto the shelf, bread into the familiar basket on the counter, each item in its place, back where it belonged. There was something deeply comforting in that simple rhythm. In the middle of the emotional chaos I had just walked through, these small, repetitive, predictable actions brought me back to something concrete, something I could hold in my hands. When I finished, I put the kettle on the stove to make myself some tea. When the water boiled, I chose my favorite mug, the pale blue ceramic one I bought at the local market years ago, and watched the tea leaves slowly unfurl in the hot water. The familiar scent of tea slowly filled the small kitchen, and for the first time since I'd walked into the apartment that afternoon, I felt like I could finally take a full, deep breath. I went back to the armchair, cupping the mug in both hands. The warmth seeped through the ceramic and into my palms. Outside, night had fully fallen. The city kept moving to its own rhythm, utterly indifferent to the little movie that had just played out in my sixth-floor apartment. And then, without warning, I started to cry. Not the dramatic, wrenching sobs from television dramas, not the shattered wail of someone who has just lost something irreplaceable. Just tears, quietly spilling over, sliding down my cheeks, while I sat there, holding my tea, staring into the darkness outside. These were tears that had been waiting decades for permission to fall. I cried for the mother I had been, the young woman working 2 shifts a day, coming home so tired she nearly collapsed into the chair, yet still forcing herself to get up to cook and check Dante's homework. I cried for the years I spent believing the warped idea that endless sacrifice was love, when often it was just fear of not being good enough, fear that if I didn't pour out everything I had, my son wouldn't love me, fear that I would die one day, completely alone. And then, bitterly enough, I realized, here I was, in the very place I'd always feared, alone. But it was a different kind of alone, not because I'd been abandoned, not because I'd been rejected, but as the direct result of choosing myself. And even though it hurt, even though it felt like I had just lost something huge, beneath that pain there was a strange sense of relief. As if I had finally put down a weight I'd been carrying for so long. I had forgotten it was there. If you've ever had to make a decision that made your whole family think you were too much, just because you refused to keep enduring, you probably know this feeling, both painful and light, both regretful and relieved. No one praises you for choosing yourself, but deep down you know, if you hadn't, you would slowly disappear from your own life. I took another sip of tea. It had cooled, but the familiar taste was still there, enough to soothe my nerves. I thought of Ruthie again, of those last conversations in the hospital. In those days, she was brutally brave, no sugarcoating, no soft lies, just the truth of someone who knew she didn't have time left for comforting illusions. "You know what the saddest part is, Veronica?" she asked me one afternoon while I was peeling an orange. "It's not that I'm dying. Everybody has to die. The saddest thing is that I spent my whole life waiting for the moment I'd finally live for myself, waiting for the kids to grow up, waiting for retirement, waiting until I had more money, waiting for one thing and then another. And now the moment I was waiting for will never come because I'm out of time." She squeezed my hand with a strength that didn't match her frail appearance. "Don't make my mistake. Don't wait until it's too late. If you need to say no, say it. If you need space, take it. If you need to choose yourself, then choose, because no one else is going to do it for you." I finished the tea and set the empty mug on the side table. The apartment sank back into its familiar quiet, broken only by the faint sounds of the city, the whisper of cars passing by, the distant laughter of someone in a nearby unit. Life went on, totally indifferent to the small revolution that had just taken place inside me. My phone buzzed again. This time, a message from my sister, Pauline. Dante had called her. Of course, news that I'd kicked my son out was probably traveling fast through the family. "Veronica, what happened? Dante called me. He's really upset, said you kicked him out of your house. He said they only asked to stay a few days. Is that true? Call me when you can." I could picture that call vividly. Dante telling the story his way, the misunderstood son, treated unfairly by his mother. Pauline, as always, trying to stand in the middle to find both sides, but no doubt softening toward Dante, because to the family, he has always been the poor baby, the youngest. And I would once again appear in the story as the rigid, hard, suddenly selfish mother in her old age. I should have felt indignant at the thought of being misunderstood. I should have wanted to call Pauline immediately, to lay out every detail, to defend myself, to explain that I wasn't the villain in this story. But then I realized something important. I didn't care as much as I used to. Because the truth is, Pauline, even though she's my sister and loves me in her way, never truly understood why I let her stay in my apartment for more than a year after her divorce. She never really saw that as a true sacrifice. She just quietly assumed, like everyone else, that I had more space, more time, more energy, because women like me always have spare pieces of themselves to hand out. I put my phone face down on the table, not replying, at least not tonight, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, maybe never. Maybe it was time to let people think of me however they wanted. And maybe it was also time for me to stop pouring my energy into trying to control the story other people tell about me. The days that followed passed with a strangely slow rhythm. Every morning I woke up and went through the same familiar routine, made coffee, washed up, ate breakfast. But nothing felt the same anymore. Now there was always a heavy feeling hanging in the air, a clear awareness that I had broken something. Although the more I thought about it, the less sure I became. What I had broken, was it the relationship between Dante and me, or was it the dysfunctional pattern we had clung to for decades? Pauline called me twice more in that first week. By the second call, her voice had changed. It was no longer just worry, there was something deeper in it. Veronica, I have been thinking a lot about what we talked about that time I stayed with you after the divorce. I heard her take a breath on the other end of the line, as if she were gathering courage to keep going. I never really thanked you properly for that year. I never really understood what you sacrificed to let me stay. I just assumed you were fine, because you never said otherwise. But I should have asked. I should have been more considerate. I had not been expecting that apology, and yet, as soon as I heard it, something in my chest loosened. A knot I had not even realized I was carrying. Thank you for saying that, Pauline. It means a lot to me. 2 weeks went by before I got the next message from Dante. It was not an apology, and not really a conversation. It was just a photo. In the photo, Dante and Keisha were standing in front of what looked like a newly finished apartment in Hawthorne. The message attached to it was only one line: "Renovation is done. We are back home." He did not mention what had happened. He did not ask how I was. It was the kind of dry, factual message you might send to a distant acquaintance more than to your own mother. But it was still something. A thin thread of contact, but a real one. And I decided to accept it exactly as that, as a very small first step. I replied, "I'm glad you two are comfortable in your own space now. Take care of yourselves." There was no reply, but I did not place much expectation on that. The days stretched into weeks. I kept living my life. I still went grocery shopping on Thursdays. I still met my friends for coffee on Tuesdays at our usual spot on Market Street in Inglewood. I still read the books I had been putting off for months. I spent whole afternoons sitting out on the balcony just watching the city move, something I had rarely allowed myself to do before, because I was always in a state of waiting for someone to need me, waiting for a phone call, waiting for some urgent matter belonging to someone else. And then, slowly, very slowly, I began to notice something. That lingering sense of guilt, the feeling that I had done something terrible, started to quiet down. In its place came another feeling, lighter, not exactly happiness, more like peace. Like finally setting down a suitcase that was far too heavy, one you had carried for so long that your arms forgot what it felt like to hold nothing at all. If you have ever made a decision that left your whole family not understanding you, but deep inside there was a very small part of you that sighed in relief, then you probably understand this part better than anyone. Sometimes peace does not arrive with applause. It comes in quiet afternoons where it is just you, a cup of coffee, and that faint sense that maybe this time I did not betray myself. A month after that day, I was standing at the produce section in the supermarket picking tomatoes when my phone rang. Dante's name appeared on the screen. This time, it was a real call, not a message. My heart skipped a beat. I set the tomatoes down, stepped out of the flow of people, and then pressed answer. Hello? Hi, Mom. His voice sounded different, softer, without the defensive edge it had the last time we spoke. How have you been, Mom? I am okay. And you? There was a pause. I could hear background noise, the sound of traffic, like he was walking outside while calling. I have been thinking a lot about what happened that day, about the things you said. He hesitated. I realized you were right. I did just show up without asking. I just assumed you would always be available, because that is how it has always been. And that is not okay. I felt another knot in my chest start to loosen. Thank you for saying that, Dante. Mom, I was wondering, would you maybe want to have lunch with me? Just you and me. We can talk. Would you like that? I realized I was smiling. Yes, I would. We met that Saturday. The conversation was not perfect. There were still awkward silences. There were still truths that were hard to say and hard to hear. But this time, everything was real. It was no longer the fake peace we had tried to maintain for so many years. The months that followed were not a straight road either. Sometimes Dante slipped back into old habits, still unconsciously treating my presence as a given. But the difference was this. Now, I had a voice, and he was learning how to listen. I realized that teaching your child to respect you does not end when they become adults. Sometimes the most important lesson comes very late, when you finally dare to say no, when you finally build the boundary that should have been there many years ago, when you finally choose yourself without wrapping it in a long string of apologies. Because being a mother does not mean becoming invisible. It does not mean you have to lay every part of yourself on an altar called motherly love. It does not mean your home, your time, your life are open resources for anyone to take from whenever they want, without asking you first. Being a mother is loving deeply, but that love also has to teach your children that real love always walks hand in hand with respect. Healthy relationships always have clear boundaries, and you, whether you are a mother, a grandmother, the woman holding the whole family together, are still a person with needs, dreams, and the basic right to decide your own life. Now, when I sit in the armchair by the window, hands wrapped around a hot cup of coffee, looking out over my small, quiet, tidy apartment in Inglewood, I can feel something I have not touched in a very long time. Pride. Pride that I chose myself. Pride that I found my voice again. Pride that I taught my son, in a hard but necessary way, that love is not the absence of boundaries, it is the respect to keep them. This home is still my home. This life is still my life. And I, Veronica Mills, 68 years old, am finally, fully, the owner of both. You know, almost my entire life, I thought loving meant giving until there was nothing left for myself. But now I understand that loving also means knowing when to say, that is enough. And then still leaving room in your heart for forgiveness, for growth, and for new beginnings. Setting boundaries does not kill love. It protects love. And when we finally learn to respect ourselves, other people begin to see our worth more clearly too. That is the peace I have found. And I hope you, the one listening to this story, will find something for yourself as well. If you see yourself somewhere in this story, if any part of it touched your heart, let me know with a like. I truly want to know how many of us are quietly walking the same path. And where are you listening to this story from, and at what moment in your day? Write it in the comments. I would love to read it. Thank you for staying with me all the way until the very end. If you would like to hear more everyday stories told with this kind of honesty, watch the other videos on the channel and hit subscribe. Right now on the screen, you will see 2 more stories that I believe you will enjoy. Pick one, click on it, and we will meet again there. Love you all.